Welcome to Meet the Candidates. I'm Nancy Seligson, Mamaroneck Town Supervisor, and I'm here today with State Senator George Latimer. I'm going to moderate our discussion today and interview George so that any of you who don't know George yet will get to know him a little bit, and those of you who know him will get to hear a little more about his issues and opinions. So George, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Nancy. I appreciate the time we'll have together.
There are so many things that New York State Senate, so many things going on in the New York State Senate, and so many things that the New York State Senate does that affects all of us. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that we have seen a lot of lately are the headlines in regard to scandals, reforms that aren't happening, that should be happening, ethics, and I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Nancy, that's the overarching issue because it's the tabloid headlines, and there are policy issues in education and the environment and transportation and taxation that are important, but they're all blotted out by the bad behavior of those who, in both the executive and the legislative branch, have breached faith with people that either put them in office by election or by appointment. We've had, just in the last 2 years, the prosecution and the conviction of the Senate Majority Leader, the number 2 Deputy Senate Majority Leader, and the Speaker of the Assembly. And those are as powerful a positions as you can get in the legislative body.
And that's that's never happened before.
Well, it's never happened at the same time. Now, but you do have, unfortunately, a tradition of corruption. Tammany Hall, the Boss Tweed ring. I know these are historical things that people don't relate to, but the reality is, I argue that this is part of a systemic problem that has to be addressed in a more comprehensive way. There isn't a single silver bullet that solves the problem. But you have had, in the last few years, a very aggressive prosecutor, Preet Bharara, and I think he's done a fantastic job. And what he's done that's most important is that he's made a case on the specifics that warrant prosecution. Because people will always say things like, well, he's dirty, or I think he's guilty of something, but you can't accuse somebody of something unless you put together a solid, researched case. And so he has done that, and every single time there's been an elected official of either party that has been indicted. Once you read the indictment, you're a lawyer and I'm not, but the bottom line is that—
I'm not, just for the record, right. I'm not.
But I'm not a lawyer, but when I read it as a layman and I see the nature of the complaint and that it's substantive, I've called for those individuals to resign, whether it's in my party or the other party. So the bottom line is that you need to have an even-handed standard, and I think what's happening prosecutorial is a positive thing. The problem is, it goes beyond the individual. I can give you many examples of an individual who was prosecuted, left office, and then his successor turned out to be corrupt. So it's not merely, as is coming up as a major issue in this campaign, term limits. I can support a term limit bill. We have term limits applied now in the county legislature. You have them in the city of Yonkers. But what you really need is going after the money, going after the centralization of power, and going after the hyperpartisanship. And if all you're going to talk about is just term limits, if that's the only thing you're going to talk about, then you're really either purposefully or accidentally missing the real place that you have to go if you want to see change in the rules of the Senate and the Assembly, and in the way we do our financing of both public activities and campaign activities.
I would agree with you, because I know that every time that someone is prosecuted and convicted, you always feel a sort of sigh of relief within yourself that, oh, they got the bad one, or that's the bad one, or it's got to be better now. But as you say, it isn't just the individuals. It really is systemic issues that have to be addressed.
There was a song from my baby boom generation by The Who. We won't get fooled again.
Yeah.
And in it, there's a line, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So just prosecuting the boss or trying to term limit the boss, which has its value, that is not the solution to the problem.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you if you think that is having an effect, though, at some level within the ranks of the Senate or legislature.
I think to some degree it does, but the bottom line is that you still had, through partisan redistricting, a gerrymandered situation where, in my House, there's 63 seats in the state Senate. 10 of them, mine being one of them, are competitive seats. 53 of them are not competitive. And the record shows that even under indictment, the last time we had a general election in 2014 at our level of government, we had 4 individuals who were under indictment and they were still reelected. And why were they reelected? Because the partisan construct of their seats meant that if you were Republican in a Republican area, you were coming back even though you're under indictment, and the same is true of some Democrats. So when I say that we have to approach this systemically, I'm not looking to dodge the issue. I want to dig into the reality of the issue. And I've tried very hard over my time in public office to use the same discipline that I did in my professional career. I have a 20-year career in business. I worked for subsidiaries of Nestle and ITT. I always laugh when people say, oh, he's a career politician, because that's the part of my life you know about.
Right.
You don't know what I did professionally in and around that time, which did overlap with my time in the county legislature as well as in the council. And that professional rigor says, go after the core of the problem, which is, and I'll repeat it one more time, it's the money, it's the centralized power, and it's the hyperpartisanship. Those are where the source of the corruption exists.
So is there a chance that we can go after those systemic problems?
Well, I think there's certainly the proposals to change those things. To go after the centralization of power, it's in a change of the rules of the Senate, and those of us who support decentralizing some of that power will make a motion to try to amend the rules of the Senate. Now, right now, you have a majority in the Senate. I'm not trying to be partisan. I'm expressing exactly what the reality is. The Senate has been controlled for 77 of the last 80 years by one party, the GOP. Susie Oppenheimer sat in this seat for 28 years before I ever got in it, and she spent 26 of those years in the minority. She's a bright, hard-working woman, and in the minority, she was stifled from having her ideas have an impact. I've been there for 4 years, just 4 years. And in those 4 years, I speak up and I have ideas, including how we go after these different things, a variety of bills to change and make more transparent the way the money flows in and out, governmentally or not. But the majority determines it. And I have to tell you, in a race where I am competing against an opponent, that opponent is supported by the Republican majority. They want her to win the seat, to join the majority, a majority that has been unwilling to do these reforms.
Okay, well, I think that gives us a good understanding, a better understanding of what's really going on. And I have to say, for one, that I wish you luck, and I wish that your colleagues would also be willing and able to go after some of those systemic problems. But the other big issue for all of us in our area is taxes. Yep. We always hear about taxes are too high, taxes are too high. And I hear it as a town supervisor all the time as well. And you know, we know that taxes go to serve the government and to create programs that are helpful, presumably, to the community. And our taxes are complicated here in Westchester, and they're complicated in the state of New York. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about the state issues?
Well, the first thing to be said is that in my time, the 4 years that I've been in the Senate and in my prior service in the Assembly, the single largest taxation that the state levies is income taxation. And we have twice cut the rates for taxation. Now, how much you pay in income tax depends on your income. The rates are what we control. And we cut those rates in 2016, phased in over the next 8 years, and then we cut them back in 2011, except on the very highest individuals back in 2011. In 2016, they're both middle class, meaning if you're making $250,000 adjusted gross income or less, we cut state taxes. We also have the lowest rates that we've had in 60 years. We've reduced the tax on manufacturing. We've reduced a variety of taxes. We've cut back on the MTA mobility tax, which was instituted because it had to be. Otherwise, we would have had a doubling of the commuter rates, and what that would have done to Mamaroneck and Larchmont and the other communities if you had a huge price to commute every day. But having said those things, the property tax burden is what we talk about, and I pay property taxes like everybody else does. The shortest, most direct answer are the state unfunded mandates that the state government places on other levels of government and the school district, and does so in a way that says you must do these things, but we're not giving you any more money to do it. Right. At the town level of government, the direct aid to the town is somewhere, in round numbers, a little below the level of $150,000 a year.
Right.
That number hasn't gone up in 6 years.
No.
And even if it doubled, it doesn't cover the kind of mandates that we placed on you. The MTA mobility tax is one example of it. That may be a $50,000 price tag, maybe more for the town of Mamaroneck. It's probably similar for the village of Mamaroneck, maybe a little less for Larchmont. But the bottom line is, when that was imposed, the local governments should have been exempted from it. That's a mandate that should be an exemption. The biggest of all mandates actually is at the county level with the Medicaid costs.
Yes.
And that's a $220 million price tag to Westchester County
I know.
to fund a program that in no other state in the union does the
funded
state
at that
require the
level.
county, the local governments to do it? And so if somebody says, well, what's the difference whether it's paid for by the county or the state? If the state pays for it, it's primarily coming out of income tax, which you and I pay proportionally based on our income. If we have to pay for it at the county level or the local level, it comes out of your property tax bill, which is not negotiable.
No.
Now, I have co-sponsored bills that would phase out the Medicaid mandate. I have co-sponsored bills that would eliminate the cost of the MTA payroll tax. I've spoken up, we may talk about education before this time is over, I've spoken up against the additional costs of the changes of education, the over-testing. You talk to anybody on the school board, that's a huge expense to the school district by having done these things. In every one of these cases, I've already stood up and spoken out against them and talked about how the state should be picking up these costs. Now, I'm in the minority. That 77-year majority is not prepared to change these policies, and they'll rail about it. They'll make speeches that sound very nice. We need to cut taxes. Taxes are bad, but they won't change the state policies that make these things happen. So I would argue that because I understand what the core of these things are, I'm not going to give you sound bites. I'm going to give you the substance of knowing what we have to do and the kind of legislation that has to pass. And if we have a different structure of leadership in the Senate come the new year, I believe we'll accomplish those things.
Well, I think that would be incredibly helpful, I know, on a municipal level, because even on the municipal level, it's very hard for people to understand that although the municipality collects your property taxes, we don't get to keep all that property tax. In fact, the bulk of it goes to the school district and the county. But we are charged with collecting it and making sure that they are made whole, whether we collect 100% of it or not. And the small percentage of people's taxes and their property tax, about 18 to 20% that actually comes to the municipality, is for all the day-to-day services that people come to expect and I think appreciate the high level of services that we provide.
This is where, Nancy, I have been critical of my colleagues in state government. I've been outspoken. I've had this conversation on the local live on this station. I've had these discussions at the summit at the Nautilus Diner. I've had this conversation and many other conversations in the community, in the Rotary clubs and the Lions clubs and so forth, where basically what it comes down to is the state government has disrespected local government over an extended period of time. Some of that comes based on we don't want to be the bad guys that have to bite the bullet, but we're the ones making the policies. And I think the important thing to understand is not to equate being in office as an incumbent with agreeing with bad public policy. I've spoken out because I was once a councilman. And when I was a councilman or when I was chair of the county legislature, we had to try to put budgets together just like you do now. The village of Larchmont, you know, that's not a huge government. And they have not a lot of fat to work with to deal with these kind of issues. So whether it's either village or the town, I understand what has to be done. I know exactly how to fix it. What I need is the support of colleagues to do these things.
Yes, and that is really a tough one when you're in a House that has such an entrenched majority and has historically. So it's interesting to think about how those dynamics can change.
Well, one of the other points to make, and this is more generic, it's not just on taxation, it'll apply if we talk about some of these other issues, education, environment, and so forth. Some of my colleagues have been in office for a long, long time. And it's very easy to say, there's the good old boy network, and that may be true. If the good old boy network is backing a young, fresh candidate, you might think that person is the voice of young, fresh ideas. It depends on who's behind them. The Republican majority, that exists now. And these aren't bad people, but the chair of the head of the Senate, John Flanagan, has been in the Senate for 24 years. He's 54 years old.
Wow.
He's been in the Senate for 24 years. I've been in for 4 years. So it's a little disingenuous to say, we need to get rid of the old dead wood. Let's get rid of George Latimer, who's been there for 4 years. I've been in other levels of government, and successfully so. But let's make sure we keep somebody in charge who's been there 24 years. Ken LaValle, fine gentleman. I disagree with him on some policies. He's headed the Higher Education Committee. He's been in the Senate as a Republican for 40 years.
Wow.
40 years. So let's be honest. The Good Old Boy Network is the clique that runs the Senate, and they don't want me coming back to the Senate because I understand how to argue forcefully for our people against their current policies.
And I think it's such an important distinction to make that it's not just the party or the policy, the party, I should say, or the length of service. It really is the individual and what they stand for and what they're willing to look at. Okay, well, let's talk about education a minute because we've heard so much about Common Core. It's on the front page of the paper very often. Education, our schools are the largest chunk of our property taxes,
Right.
and it's very frustrating to people. You have people who really regard the schools as the most important factor in deciding where to live in, which community to live in, and others who have no longer have kids in school, and so they start to feel very differently about it. What is your role with the education issue?
Well, this is where I've been critical of the Republican leadership so far in my conversation. Let me now be critical of some Democratic positions because I've stood up against positions in my own party. I think the changes that we've made to education in the last few years, the decision to overtest students, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade. I think the decision to have a program where teachers are encouraged to teach to a test rather than for experiential teaching, and where we want that one-size-fits-all, I think that's the wrong direction. And that's what the state has been pushing. I stood up almost alone as a Democratic senator against other senators in my own party arguing for a change in the makeup of the Board of Regents. We have in this community Saul Cohen, a wonderful fellow who lived for many years in New Rochelle. Now he and his wife live here. They live in the town, Larchmont Post Office. And I spoke to him as a former member of the Board of Regents as to the wrong direction that we're heading in. So I think this is an example of my independence from, in this sense, both parties. Take the position that makes sense. We need local control of the schools, not Albany control, not DC control. And what that means is this: if Mamaroneck and the Rhinebeck districts are performing at a high level, and they are, high level of graduation, high level of results on the Regents exams, not testing in fifth grade and sixth grade, but when you complete geometry, when you complete biology and you take the standardized Regents test, those standardized tests make sense. Do you have a grasp of geometry? Prove it. Do you have a grasp of biology? Prove it at the end. If you track the cohort of graduates from Mamaroneck and Rhinebeck, and I might add Rye and Harrison and the other neighboring districts, you'll see that our educational end result has been terrific. So my suggestion to the state, leave them alone. Let the people who are doing a good job on policy continue that, and don't try to do a one-size-fits-all. Put your energy and your creativity in education into the districts that we know have trouble. One of them is the district I grew up in. I don't represent the community, but I grew up in Mount Vernon, on the south side of Mount Vernon, working class, poor kid, African-American neighborhood. And even more so today, it's a rough, difficult community. There are lots of reasons why there's performance issues. That's where you put the attention and the energy, not rearranging the deck chairs when Mamaroneck and Rhinebeck are proving it to be correct. So to me, the thrust of education is an expensive proposition. Reduce the unnecessary mandates, the extra testing, all that kind of stuff, and through your school board, through the voice of the people who have the right to vote for a school budget, have the right to vote for school trustees, have the right to go right down to the elementary school, go right into the principal's office. You have that influence right now. Why homogenize that into Albany knows better and DC knows better? And if anybody thinks I'm just saying this is the campaign season, you can go onto YouTube. George Latimer, John King. John King is now the U.S. Department of Education head.
And he was
state commissioner. And you'll see me questioning. You see my glasses on at the time because I was trying to be studious. You'll see me questioning him very forcefully because, look, I'm not afraid to speak up strongly about things. You may recall I got in trouble with a Democratic governor within the last 10 years.
I do remember that.
And, folks saw my political life flash in front of me. Now, he wound up in a scandal. He wound up leaving office. But at the time, it wasn't that I was arrogant, but I knew I was right. And I thought he was wrong, and he came after me. But I stood my ground. And I stood my ground on fighting on the Board of Regents as well. I think we're in a wrong direction in education. Let the parents, the teachers, the local administrators drive the train, not the bureaucrats in Albany.
Well, I have to thank you for also standing up on behalf of local municipalities in regard to the tax cap, because that's another one-size-fits-all issue that has been promulgated throughout the state. And as you know, and I think most of our viewers know, there's a so-called 2% tax cap on the tax levy of municipalities in our state. And for those municipalities that have been well run, well governed, and are in healthy financial positions, that are providing a certain level of service that is desired and appreciated by their constituents, it doesn't seem right to have to be hemmed in by that 2% tax cap, which in reality is always much lower than 2% because it's based on many different factors, one of which is the growth factor. And in the town of Mamaroneck, as in all other municipalities, we don't get to control our pension contributions, our health care contributions, or all of the other mandated costs that we have that are really regulated by the state. And that's what's so frustrating for us. But I did see the YouTube video of you standing up and speaking to your Senate House about how it is not working and how there are parts of that cap, parts that are included now that should be withdrawn. That when we make capital improvements in our infrastructure and when we are making great investments in our community, those should not be included as part of the cap.
When you go back to the original tax cap vote in 2011, and this is the attack ads that are coming in the mail, and they'll probably be on TV from this opponent and my last 3 opponents. Here's the problem. They'll say George didn't vote for the tax cap, and that's true. George also said at the time that the promise was there would be mandate relief to accompany the cap.
Right.
To cap a municipal government at a solid 2%, if we relieved hundreds of thousands of dollars of mandated costs, then it says we've relieved burdens that you shouldn't have. Now manage your government efficiently. I have no doubt that these governments could have stayed within it, but we didn't do that. We didn't deliver the mandate relief that was promised, and it wasn't a 2% cap. It's a 0.12% cap. Now on television, you'll get a 30-second spot that'll say George Latimer, da 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 da. But this is an intelligent group of people in these communities. They're not stupid. When they do research, if they do that, they'll analyze and they'll see that what I've said all along is that you have to have a local government that provides basic services. That's why people move here, and that's why people stay here. And you can do that with a tax cap if you relieve the unfunded mandates. You've got to do both of them. Now, where are we today? I voted to extend the cap because it's popular and it's going to be in place, so there's no reason to howl at the moon. But I have pushed for the unfunded mandates to be relieved as the necessary step to make the tax cap work, because there is a cynical game going on. The cynical game is people who know the numbers. They see that we're heading in a bad direction. We're going to be burning furniture for firewood. If not now, then soon. And the poorer the community, the faster that's going to happen. But they cynically will argue for the tax cap, but they won't argue for the mandate relief because that costs the state and the state budget. And I may be out of office, and you may be out of office, but we will regret, and people will look back and say, they were saying the right thing, but we didn't listen to them. And this is the time now to change the policy direction so that we don't regret it 3, 4, 5 years down the road.
I agree, and I thank you for fighting for that change in policy direction, and I want to join you in that fight. One policy direction, though, that we've been seeing a lot of in the state as well is in regard to the environment and the REV program, that is the Renewable Energy Vision. We get a lot of information from the state and lots of different emails regarding many, many different programs in terms of trying to reduce energy, electric cars, charging stations, green efforts. And frankly, I have to say it's confusing. I mean, it all sounds good, and it all seems like we are trying to move in the right direction. And I'm proud to say that the town of Mamaroneck has been a leader in the environment for a long time. But I'd like to see some help from the state in kind of understanding and wading through all of this information as well.
Well, a couple of things matter, and the environmental track record is a bit of a mixed bag. There are good things that happened. Assemblyman Steve Otis rightfully takes credit for taking leadership on creating a capital projects fund for water projects. Wonderful, positive step. We added $300 million, we raised up to $300 million the Environmental Protection Fund, which is a source of resources that towns and other entities can go in and tap. And so those are good things. I think the governor's executive order on hydrofracking was consistent with good environmental policy. But by the same time, this is where you run afoul of problems in the Senate. I think that there is just an unwillingness in Senate leadership to accept climate change as a scientific reality. And there are climate change deniers, and they point to the fraction, the smallest fraction of scientists who, disagree with the 95% of the scientists that say there's a true climate change issue.
Yes.
Now, that doesn't mean tomorrow we do everything that we could possibly do. And as a state, we don't act unilaterally, but we accept it as a legitimate warning of what's coming down the line. Because now that I have a grandchild, I start to think a little longer term. I don't want someone to say to her, wasn't your grandfather
yes.
in office back at the turn of the last century? What did he do about it? This terrible thing that we face in 2050 or 2060, long after I'm gone. And I think this is where you need environmentalism that is intelligent and prudent, not just reactionary to whatever the momentary situation is. And I also think it's a false argument, Nancy, where we pit the economic growth against the environment, like it's an either-or choice.
It doesn't have to be.
No, and I think, if you looked at the renewable energy of the St. Lawrence River Valley and the hydroelectric scenario, that made upstate New York a vibrant economic area, so much so that the Erie Canal made New York the dominant state of the nation for 100 years. Now we look at other renewable sources. That should be our priority. But, there are interests politically on oil and gas that just say, we just want to go with the fossil fuel. Let's keep drilling and let's keep doing that. And let's not worry about what happens tomorrow. I know our time is short, so it's a much longer discussion. And at any point in time, anybody who's watching wants to call me, they're welcome to give me a call. My office, governmental office is 934-5250, and they're welcome to call me and we can have this conversation in greater detail.
Okay, I would appreciate that because I think there are a lot of opportunities to take advantage of things in New York State, but we need some more help on it as well. But thank you,
The final word is you get to choose who you think should be your senator for the next 2 years, and I hope the things I've said and done warrant your support.
I think that you have done a wonderful job in our communities. I think people know and like you very much, and I'm hoping for the best for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for joining us for Meet the Candidates and speaking with Senator George Latimer.